Imagine a simple street in India's slums, a place where children played and life seemed normal. Now, imagine a house nearby, a seemingly ordinary home, hiding a secret so vile it would stain an entire nation. This is a true story of kidnapping, murder, mutilation, and cannibalism. A story that will leave you forever changed and demanding answers from the system that failed every victim. The story of House D5 in Noida isn't just a true crime story. It's a terrifying look at a system that ignored the cries of the poor and allowed a monster to flourish. I want you to watch this video to the very end. At the end, we will have a frank and necessary discussion about the systemic failures that create both the criminals and the victims, a conversation that demands our collective outrage. To understand the horror that unfolded in that house, we must first rewind the clock to a time before the darkness, a time when life in the Nithari village was filled with struggle, but also with hope. On one side of the road stood the gleaming modern homes of Sector 31, a symbol of India's rapid economic growth. But just across the street, in the village of Nithari, was a world of stark contrast, where daily wage laborers, auto rickshaw drivers, and domestic helpers lived in small, makeshift shanties, fighting for every single rupee. Among these families was that of Rimpa Haldar. At just 14 years old, Rimpa was the light of her parents' lives. She wasn't just a child of the slums. She was a girl with dreams, a vibrant soul in a world of hardship. She would help her family, run errands, and laugh with her friends, a picture of youthful innocence. But a shadow fell over her world in February 2005. Like a ghost, Rimpa Haldar vanished without a trace, and a new kind of dread crept into the already anxious community. But little did anyone know, her disappearance was just the beginning of a chilling, horrifying pattern. For months, and then years, the disappearances became a dark, accepted part of life in Nithari. The whispers began, growing into a low, mournful hum of fear. A child would go out to play and never come back. A teenager would walk to the market and vanish into thin air. Parents, frantic with worry, would rush to the police station, their hearts hammering with a mix of fear and fading hope. They would beg, plead, and weep, but they were met with a wall of indifference. The police would brush them off, telling them their children were probably just runaways, that they would return. "Your kids are always roaming around the slums. They'll come back in a few days," they were told. A cruel and dismissive line that was a betrayal of a community already living on the margins. The families were poor, and their children were not considered important enough to warrant a proper investigation. For nearly 2 years, not a single formal complaint was even registered. The darkness grew, and the fear became a constant companion. Parents began to hold their children tighter, their smiles fading into strained lines of worry. The innocence of the village was being slowly, brutally murdered long before the bodies were even found. And all this time, a quiet, unassuming man was watching from the shadows. His name was Surinder Koli, and he was the domestic help at a luxurious bungalow in Sector 31, House D5. The owner, a wealthy businessman named Moninder Singh Pandher, was often away, leaving Koli in charge of the palatial home. While the village was consumed by the mystery of the missing children, Koli was just a face in the crowd, a silent figure in the background. But as we will soon discover, his silence was a mask for a monstrous appetite. The years of anguish came to a sickening head in December 2006. 2 men from the village were passing by House D5 when something foul caught their attention. The smell was overpowering, a sweet, putrid stench that made their stomachs turn. It was a smell they knew well from the village, a smell of death and decay. They began to investigate, and what they saw next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. If you've made it this far, you know that stories like these are very difficult to work on. They require deep research and a commitment to telling the stories of those who cannot speak for themselves. If you appreciate our work and want us to keep bringing you stories like this, please consider subscribing to our channel. Now let's get back to the story. A hand, small and skeletal, was protruding from a drain, directly behind the house. Police were called, but this time they could not turn a blind eye. The sheer volume of missing children and the visible evidence of the tiny hand forced them to act. A new inspector was on duty, and he ordered the drain to be opened. What they discovered next was the stuff of nightmares. The drain was a watery grave, a mass of skeletal remains, skulls, and bones, the horrific final resting place of what appeared to be children. The police were stunned, but the people of Nithari were not. They had known all along, their unspoken fears confirmed in the most brutal way imaginable. The discovery of the bodies led police to zero in on the residents, to the arrest of the house's owner, Moninder Singh Pandher, and his domestic servant, Surinder Koli. While Pandher claimed he knew nothing, it was Koli's confession that shattered every last shred of sanity. His words were calm, cold, and utterly monstrous. He confessed to luring the children into the house with promises of candy or a job. He would then brutally murder them, before dragging their bodies to the bathroom to dismember them. But it didn't stop there. The confession went from horrifying to unspeakable. Koli claimed to have engaged in necrophilia, and in a chilling revelation that sent shockwaves across the country, he confessed to acts of cannibalism. He claimed to have cooked and eaten parts of the victims' bodies, a monstrous detail that was so vile it was almost unbelievable. But the evidence was there, buried in that drain, a testament to the unholy rituals of a man who had been hiding in plain sight. And here is where the first great twist is revealed. This was not a new development. The horrific acts had been going on for years. So, why did no one do anything? The discovery of the bodies ignited a firestorm of public outrage. The media descended upon Nithari, and the once unknown village became a national symbol of a horrifying crime and a massive betrayal of public trust. Protests erupted, demanding justice for the forgotten children and accountability for the negligent police. The initial investigation was quickly exposed for what it truly was, a textbook case of incompetence and indifference. The police's laziness, lack of training, and shocking lack of empathy had allowed a serial killer to operate in plain sight for 2 long years. Their failure to take the concerns of the poor seriously led to a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The case was swiftly handed over to the Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, to bring some semblance of order to the chaos. The CBI's investigation uncovered more chilling details. Koli had confessed to the murders of over a dozen people, mostly children, and even a young woman named Payal. They found personal belongings of the victims, school bags, clothes, inside the D5 bungalow, a haunting museum of the lives that had been so cruelly taken. The evidence was overwhelming, and it seemed like a slam-dunk case. The nation held its breath, waiting for the monsters to be brought to justice. But then, a red herring emerged. The police's initial theory was that Pandher, the rich businessman, was the mastermind, and Koli was merely his accomplice. The media painted a picture of a wealthy, depraved man who used his servant to procure victims for a dark, hedonistic lifestyle. Koli's own confession was a jigsaw puzzle of contradictions. He confessed to some murders but denied others, and the details often shifted. Was he a cold-blooded killer, a pawn, or simply a man under immense pressure to confess? The truth, it turned out, was far more complicated and far more shocking than anyone could have ever imagined. What followed was a long, painful, and often confusing legal battle that spanned more than a decade. The CBI filed 19 cases against Pandher and Koli. The lower courts handed down death sentences to both men in multiple cases, a verdict that was met with a sigh of relief from a nation that had been holding its breath for justice. The victims' families, who had fought tirelessly for years, believed that their long nightmare was finally over. But this case was never going to have a simple, satisfying ending. In a stunning and unbelievable turn of events, the Allahabad High Court in 2023 acquitted both Moninder Singh Pandher and Surinder Koli in all 12 cases in which they were sentenced to death. The court's ruling was a scathing indictment of the very system that was supposed to deliver justice. The judges cited lack of evidence and called the entire investigation nothing short of a betrayal of public trust by responsible agencies. They pointed out that the prosecution had failed to prove the guilt of the accused beyond a reasonable doubt. The confessions, which had been the backbone of the case, were deemed unreliable not only because the police had failed to follow the proper legal procedures for gathering evidence, but also because Koli himself later claimed that his confession had been beaten out of him. The acquittal sent a shockwave across India, reigniting the public's outrage and the family's anguish. Victims' parents, who had waited nearly 2 decades for justice, were left with nothing. One father, Durga Prasad, whose 7-year-old daughter was murdered, declared, "This court might have acquitted those monsters, but there is a bigger court of God who will not spare them." But let's be honest. Let's call it what it really was. The real crime of those children was being born into poverty. Their small lives were considered so insignificant, so disposable, that their frantic parents' cries were brushed aside. We have to face a terrifying truth. If a child of a police commissioner or a politician had gone missing, it wouldn't have taken 20 other disappearances for someone to notice and take action. The entire nation would have stopped to search for them. But the problem is deeper than that. It's the very system that trains incompetent, unempathetic officers, the same system that refused to even register the cries of desperate parents. It is a system built on class, a system where some lives are deemed more valuable than others. At the end of the day, it's the responsibility of each and every one of us to be the voice for those whose voices are smothered by their circumstances and by their poverty. If this story shook you, stay with us for more cases that reveal the terrifying underbelly of the human experience. Don't forget to subscribe.